I love stories. I've always loved stories. I was the kid who would be sitting at the end of the driveway or in the sandpit playing with a little toy dragon and a toy horse that I got from the top of a birthday cake and a ballerina from a Christmas cracker, which were three of my favorite toys as a small child, and telling myself stories. This was before I learned to read, and I was a precocious reader. I learned to read from flashcards that were stored in a glass-fronted cabinet in the living room, red writing on white cardboard. When I actually went to school, I was put into a special advanced class because I got bored reading along with my classmates, so I had to go and do advanced reading. Before that, my parents would tell me stories. My whole life has been full of stories. My dad used to tell me and my brother the story about a prince and princess who lived in a magical castle, and there was a secret passageway that you could get to from the library. You pressed the eye of one of the carved lion heads that was on top of one of the bookcases, and it swung open, and you'd go into the secret passageway down into a cave system underneath the castle. And I don't remember what we, or the prince and princess, did down there, but there was a new episode of the story every night for months, probably longer. This is the background of where I'm coming from. I would read everything that I could find once I could read. I read fiction, but also mythology, history, cookbooks, gardening books, weird self-help new age books, everything. I was taking books out of the adult section of the library at 9 or 10 on my mum's library card. And it's because I'd read everything in the children's section more than once. And I'd read everything at home, or everything I was capable of reading at the time. This was in Johannesburg, which is a city in South Africa where I lived until I was 11. At 11, I moved to Perth with my family, and I loved it here. I've lived here ever since, with a few stints in other places. For example, I have a story set in a hidden valley in South Korea, which was inspired by hikes that I went on through the parklands and the hills near Andong, which is a small town near the third largest city in South Korea, Daegu, because I lived there for a year teaching English as a second language. And I went walking through the forests, and this story just occurred to me. It's on hold. Never fear, until book 3 of the Red Dragon trilogy is written. I'm not working on it. I lived in London for a year, and again, it's full of stories. Different people, different cultures, learning things. My favorite thing walking around London was finding the canals. Did you know that London had canals? I didn't know that. I walked around the middle of Camden and I found a canal. In use. People used to move boats to and from the Thames, I guess. Just these little waterways hidden behind buildings. Everyone told me that London was a boring city, that it was all grey and concrete and raining all the time, and it's just not true. I found a bar that specialised in caipirinhas, that's the national cocktail of Brazil. It's made with rum or cachaça, which is a sugarcane spirit that's very much like rum, lime and sugar. And this bar served only these drinks. You could get them in all different flavours, passion fruit pulp on the top, or berries, or apple pie filling. Just that. London is gorgeous and full of stories and full of people, and that's the thing that I loved about it. That's the thing that I loved about everywhere I've been. Learning about new people and writing stories about people learning the things that I was learning. That's what I do. I make up stories. Perth is just as interesting. WA is just as interesting, just as full of stories, just as full of magic. When I got back from that year in London, I came off the aeroplane out of the airport and I could smell that I was home, because the air here is different to anywhere else. It smells of eucalypts and salt and that indefinable something that comes in on the easterlies out of the desert. It's different to anything else that you'll find anywhere in the world. I loved it when I moved here. Coming from Johannesburg, which is in the mountains, it's a landlocked city. We moved to this seaside town and it was like going on holiday and never leaving. The beaches, the ocean. I love the ocean. And there were trees everywhere and parks everywhere, and Perth is beautiful. That's why I tell stories. Other than the fact that I just tell stories because stories are what we're made of. Stories don't just tell us who we are and who we can become, although they do that as well. That's why you get the hero's journey, you get all of the coming-of-age narratives, and we see so many of those. But stories also tell us where we are. They connect us to the landscape. They connect us to the history and the people and the places that shape us. And that's important. That's a thing that people don't notice until they don't have it. There's a quote that I love. I don't know who said it. I read it as one of these dumb Facebook reposts. It says, "Writing is the first and best magic that humanity ever discovered." And if you think about it, it's true. We draw symbols on the flattened out corpse of a dead tree. And by doing that, we make somebody else hallucinate something that we've created. They don't need to meet us. They don't need to know our names or know who we are. But they still have something in their heads that didn't exist until we thought of it. And that's pretty powerful magic if you think about it. When I was little, and people would ask what I wanted to be when I grew up, the only answer that made sense to me was an author. You know, my peers and friends wanted to be firefighters or astronauts or vets or dancers or, in one notable instance, a snowboard. I wanted to be an author. I wanted to make stories because authors are heroes. The thing that I didn't understand for the longest of times was that the difference between wanting to be an author and being an author was just writing the stories down, sharing them with somebody. And it took me a long time to start doing that. I probably started writing my stories down in my mid-teens, 14, 15. The first time I actually finished writing down a story was while I was living in South Korea. I signed up for something called Nanowrimo, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is National Novel Writing Month. It's a sort of a competition, and I say sort of because it's not judged, and there are not really any prizes. The idea is everybody has at least one story they can tell, at least one book they can write. And Nanowrimo says, you've got this story, here's the challenge. In a single month, begin and finish writing a 40 to 50,000 word novel. There's a website with a word counter. It doesn't read what you've written, it just counts the words. Or you can just use it as an excuse to write and not use the word counter. And at the end of the competition, your prize is a novel that you've written. It's a pretty good prize. So I signed up while I was living in South Korea because I needed something to do other than working and exploring and hiking and everything else that I was doing. And during the 1 month, I wrote just over 40,000 words, which was a lot. I wrote about 2,500 words a day whilst working full-time, teaching English to classes of kids between 8 and 16 and trying to learn another language. But it was fun, And every time I finished a scene or a chapter, I would post it on a private blog for people back home in Perth to read. And their enthusiasm kept me writing. So I've finished 3 linked novellas, which since then I've actually expanded out into 3 separate novels. Well, 2.5. And it was a really good experience. As an aside, I should probably introduce myself. For those who don't know, I'm Danielle Linder. I have 2 published novels, urban fantasy. I have 4 more that are finished and currently going through the editing process, which takes a long time. Editing is hard. Getting someone to edit your work is hard. The 2 that I have published are currently available on Amazon through Kindle. They will hopefully soon be available as physical books as well. The first one, No Reflections, follows 3 cousins who discover that magic is real and dangerous. It's set in Perth, well, in WA, and these 3 go camping down south, and when they come home, a magical creature follows them. And then the second book, Dragon's Teeth, is the sequel, which is set primarily in the fairy otherworld, where the first book is set primarily in and around Perth. In the to-edit queue, I've got books 1 and 2 of a linked trilogy set in the same world, but mostly with different characters, because some of the characters just didn't want to sit down and be done. That happens. In fact, one of my favorite authors, Terry Pratchett, who I was fortunate enough to actually meet and listen to in person when he spoke about his books, and I've read a lot of his books and the author's notes and forewords as well. He said that characters do that, or they did that for him. And he also said that the best thing to do is to just let them do it, because the results are quite interesting. If a character wants more time on the page, that character's got more to say. Pratchett didn't really write urban fantasy, which is my current genre. Although the Guards trilogy did occur mostly inside cities, and it was definitely fantasy, so maybe it does count. But if I was going to give a recommendation for urban fantasy writers, I would have to pick Charles de Lint and Neil Gaiman. They're 2 of my favorite authors. I try to read everything that either of them writes, and I have not yet been disappointed by any of it. Neil Gaiman's Neverwhere is one of my favorite books and favorite TV series, for those who haven't seen the TV adaptation. I love the idea that this hidden world sits just underneath the world that we know. That has always really resonated with me. And I love that his fae are just people. They have problems and feuds and debts and interpersonal issues just like anybody else. And then they're also weird and magic and crazy. I love that. There's a scene in Neverwhere where the protagonist, Dick, is following the Marquis de Carabas, which, again, the Marquis de Carabas is a call-out to Puss in Boots, and that in itself is fantastic. So Dick is following the Marquis de Carabas down a dead-end alleyway, while the Marquis tells us, and tells Dick, a little bit about the magic and the world of Neverwhere, provides some exposition. And Dick is just following him, and the Marquis talks, and then he finishes suddenly with, "But you don't want to know about that." And it's hard, as the audience, as the reader, not to think, I really do want to know about that, please don't stop. But he does. He stops. He doesn't tell you any more, and you have to keep reading. You have to keep following, just like Dick has to keep following the Marquis, to find out anything more about what's going on. And that, I think that is good writing. It's something that I try to do. I have so much lore and background information. Not even just in my head. I have things written down to make sure that they stay consistent. But I'm not going to tell you all of those things, because it wouldn't be any fun like that. Charles de Lint, on the other hand, is the reason that I know that you can take bits and pieces of different mythologies, stories, all sorts of things, and mash them together, give them a new face, and show them to people as something new. I love the way in books like Moonheart, he pulled Celtic mythology and the stories of the North American First Nations peoples together and just twisted them together like they made sense together. And they never had before, but they do. It's beautiful. I loved that book the first time I read it, and I love what he does with that mythology. I blame Charles de Lint for my inclination to take all of the mythology that I read voraciously as a child and teenager and drag it kicking and screaming into urban fantasy. I will stop with the recommendations there, although honourable mentions to Diana Wynne-Jones for things like Howl's Moving Castle and to C.J. Cherry's Rusalka trilogy, which those are three of my favourite books in the world. But author recommendations and book recommendations is an endless rabbit hole that I could go down forever. I'm sure if anyone's interested, they can ping me, hit me up on Twitter, and I will give you more recommendations until you are tired of them. But in the meantime, having given a couple of recommendations, having spoken a little bit about myself and my background, I'd like to tell you about my process. Every author's process is different, so this is just mine. This is how I write. But I have read a lot of fiction, and I have read a lot of author's notes and forewords and afterwords, where people answer the questions that readers most often ask. And the question that seems to be asked the most is, how do you do it? So this is how I do it. I start with an idea. It can be anything. It could be a dream. In fact, one of the books in the editing queue literally started because I had a dream about a villain trying to take over the world to save it from a worse villain. So that's what one of the stories is about. It could be an idea that just comes from a question. What if something? It could be an interesting factoid. For example, did you know that the first edition printings of Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species, they used Bible pages as stiffeners in the covers? You can actually tell a genuine first edition printing of The Origin of Species because it has Bible pages inside its cover. And this was pretty common at the time because paper was expensive and Bibles were usually printed on fairly good quality paper. So when you were publishing a book on a budget, you'd use pages from other books inside the cover to stiffen it up. My partner does bookbinding as a hobby, so I learn things about bookbinding every few weeks. He told me that, and I immediately thought, wouldn't it be fun? Wouldn't it be interesting if Charles Darwin was secretly a vampire hunting wizard? If the Bible pages weren't there by coincidence or because it was cheap, they were there on purpose, because then he would be able to take this book and use the combined powers of faith and science to hunt the demonic legions of vampires across the world. And there you've got an idea. I'm going to write that at some point. And that idea was great because it came with a character. That's the next step, a character. The character doesn't have to be the protagonist. It can be the villain. It can be a side character. The first characters that I created for No Reflections were two of the minions of the evil red dragon who's trying to take over the world? Or is he? Maybe. The answer is still unclear. We're up to the end of book 2. These two characters, I imagined them having a conversation. I was listening to Eye in the Sky by the Alan Parsons Project, which is a reasonably obscure 80s band that my mum likes. And I was listening to the lyrics of the song and imagining these two fairies having a conversation about their psychotic boss. I didn't write it down. I just had it in my head, and I had the two characters in my head, Nyssa and Azarol. Nyssa with golden eyes and owl-like features, all sharp cheekbones and bravado, and Az with his earring and his grin like everything's fine, nothing's wrong with the world, while underneath he's all like, no, how did I get here? Please help. And those characters carried the story, even though they're not the main characters, even though they don't appear for the first 3 chapters of the book, 2 chapters of the book. So the process goes like this. Once I have an idea, and I have at least a few characters, I take a bunch of post-it notes and I spend a few hours writing scenes and plot points on post-it notes and sticking them on the floor or a table and shooing my cats away from them, and trying to put them in some kind of order that makes sense, and then finding where there are logical gaps between something happens, something else happens, and in between something. And then after I've put them in an order that makes sense, put more post-it notes in, I transfer all of the post-it notes to a notebook, which inevitably involves adding more post-it notes when I find more gaps, and I draw arrows in between them. And this process, by the way, is something that was suggested by an author called Rachel Aaron, who she's very talented and quite prolific. If you'd like to look her up, the first book of the trilogy of hers that I read is called Nice Dragons Finish Last. And it's very good. If you like urban fantasy, I would thoroughly recommend it. So Rachel Aaron writes a ridiculous amount. She can write 10,000 words a day, which is huge. And this is the process that she uses to plan out her novels. It works really well. I've tried doing it in software, like process flow diagrams, and it just isn't the same. Physical actually works better for me. It's not going to be true of everybody, but post-it notes are really useful. As an aside, and this is not going out on International Women's Day, but part of the reason for this author's talk was International Women's Day, I write a lot of female characters. Part of that is because it's easy. I am female. I live in a female mind and body. But part of it is also because it's important. Representation is important. Growing up, my favorite fantasy novels were the ones that had female protagonists, heroines, girls like me, girls who wanted to go on adventures and change the world, who were kind and brave and clever and practical. And there weren't all that many books like that at the time, but I cherished them when I found them. And fantasy is better now than it was. Urban fantasy especially is better than it was, especially for female protagonists. But it's still important. It's important that everybody who reads a book can find a book to read where they can identify with the characters, where they can be the prince or princess, where they can find a character who feels like them and learns to be brave and kind and practical, who goes on adventures and changes the world and finds the best self that they can be and learns to be that. Everybody needs to have stories like that. And If I can give that experience to one person, then I think I'm winning. I'm doing the right thing. So part of it is that. So I have my post-it notes. I've spent a few hours with the cats. I've put them in a notebook. The next thing I do after that is I copy the contents of the post-it notes into an outline, and then I start writing. I don't write beginning to end necessarily. I'll write a scene here and a scene there, and then a scene that leads into one of the other scenes. But I try not to go back and rewrite things until I'm done. That's the first edit, the rewriting. Unless I write myself into a corner, or I write myself into a block where the characters just don't want to do the thing that I need them to do, in which case sometimes there's rewriting, which is tedious. And all the advice says, kill the things you love when you're a writer. So instead, I take all the scenes that I love that don't work and I put them in a separate file, like the dead scene attic, and I hold onto them forever in case I might ever be able to use them again. I very seldom use them again. But they're not dead. They're just sleeping. If I'm really focused, if I'm doing really well, I can write 5,000 words a day. If I am doing anything other than writing, reading for pleasure or even inspiration, making dinner, playing with my cats, socializing with friends and family, it's closer to 2,000 to 3,000 words a day. Sometimes more, sometimes less. That's about what I can manage. In November last year for Nanowrimo, I wrote 80,000 words across 2 novels. Both of them I had already started before the 1st of November, so technically it was cheating, but it's an excuse to write. And I finished both novels, one at 130,000 words and one at just over 100,000 words. Those 2 are in the queue to edit. I'll take breaks for research. So much research. Did you know that lions died out in Europe and especially in England around 12,000 years ago? So my character, born in the early Middle Ages, really could not have met a lion. Not unless it was an escaped zoo animal or something that wandered in from the other world. It's useful to know that kind of thing. It's useful to note it down as well, so that you don't have them talking about the lion that they met, and then in the next book you're like, oh no, lions died out way before that. So much research, so much background information. But I'll also read for inspiration. I'll read for not ideas as such, but feelings. If I'm writing something with Lovecraftian eldritch beings, I'll read some old Conan stories or some Lovecraft or some of the newer eldritch horror, just to get that sense of things not being as they should be. And then I write. That's my process, that's it. Then I'm finished. I go back. Sometimes the outline and what I write doesn't really match up. For instance, the book that I'm working on at the moment, the 3rd book of the Red Dragon trilogy, the protagonist, Robin, is having a conversation with her magical grandfather, the primordial dragon, and that wasn't supposed to happen. She was supposed to have a conversation with the Red Dragon about his childhood and trauma, and he just doesn't want to talk about it. He's not cooperating. He's not even going to be in the same space as her to have the conversation. So instead, she's having a conversation with her grandfather. And I'm going to have to rework the entire outline because that wasn't meant to happen. And the things she's supposed to learn in the conversation with the Red Dragon, she's not learning. So there's a bit of work to be done there. But I would like to read you a snippet of that story This is 100% in draft. It hasn't been finished, it hasn't been edited, so it's a little rough. But it's what I'm working on, so it's close to my heart at the moment. So this is an excerpt from In Sea Glass, Red Dragon, Book 3. Robin sat up with a gasp, her empty teacup falling suddenly to the hardwood veranda floor, where it cracked neatly in two. Shit, she muttered. It was still early, much, much too early. The sun was barely up, and a ground mist had rolled up from the lake to waft knee-high across the open space between the lake itself and the trees. Where there had been, was going to be, where she expected to see Talzin. The tree line was untenanted. Robin stood up slowly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. She walked to the edge of the veranda, one slow, reluctant step at a time. "Hello?" she said. "Is there anyone? No, I must be dreaming." "Not precisely dreaming, granddaughter," said a soft, androgynous voice from somewhere at ground level. Robin looked down. A huge black tiger snake was lying across the stairs up to the veranda. It was almost as long as Robin was tall. Gleaming black eyes like chips of jet stared at her. "Not precisely dreaming, but something like it," said Robin warily. The snake moved, drawing its coils up and turning more towards her. Robin took a step backwards. "Peace," said the snake. "If I wanted to threaten you, I would do so." "Sorry, you're a tiny bit threatening anyway," said Robin, being extremely venomous and probably big enough to try eating a human, even if it probably wouldn't go well for you. The snake made a weird sound like a kettle boiling. After a second, Robin recognized it as laughter. "You will make a good king," it said finally. "What do you want, little dragon?" "I didn't come here wanting anything. I'm not even sure how I got here, or where here is. It's not my Grand's lake house, even if it looks like it is." "You're very certain," said the snake. "Yes," said Robin. She didn't elaborate. The snake didn't need to know how she knew, didn't need to know that the air smelled wrong, with too much heavy, wet greenery in it, or that the carry trees would be flowering by now, or that the lack of birdsong was making her deeply uncomfortable. The snake lifted its head, and it got larger. Robin didn't see it change. It didn't swell or puff up in any visible way. It was just there, immovable as a mountain, like a shadow growing as the light behind it moved. The creature shifted from stretched out to coiled up, from a large but not unreasonably sized snake to something monstrous and terrifyingly huge, as thick around as Robin's waist. It reared up, and in place of its head and jaw, an almost human face and torso emerged from the thick neck of the snake, glossy black and scaled just like the rest of it. A black tongue flicked out, tasting the air, and glittering black eyes remained focused on Robin's increasingly pale face. "Where exactly am I, if I'm not dreaming, and I'm not at Grand's lake house?" asked Robin. "That is complicated, granddaughter," said the snake. So, for a comparison, I also have an excerpt from the first book. This was written when I was, the first version of it was written when I was 16, after going on a camping trip down south, somewhere around Pemberton or Northcliffe. And I wrote it because I went down and swam in the sea and lived like a complete hippie for a long weekend, came back salt-covered and stiff and stinky. But I felt like the beaches and the tide pools down along that part of the coast should have magic. Because to me, they were magic. So I wrote the first version of this scene, and I'm not going to read you the first version. I do have a copy of it somewhere, and it's terrible. But this is the final published version of that first scene, part of it. This is from the first book of Red Dragon, No Reflections. Robin was never sure why she wasn't more surprised when she saw the mermaid. She was surprised, definitely, but more because she hadn't expected to see anyone there at all, out past the rocks, on an isolated, almost unsignposted beach in the middle of nowhere. At first glance, she was just an attractive woman, stretched out in the last of the afternoon sunlight, next to a large tide pool. It was only after a few seconds that the eye moved past the long copper-coloured hair and the bare freckled breasts, and took in her tail. The first thing she reminded Robin of was a butterfly, with the brilliantly gaudy peacock colours of her, copper hair, and then that tail, black and yellow and blue, glistening in the water. The second image she brought to mind was of a snake. The mermaid sat up and moved backwards at once, in an impossibly graceful, sinuous movement. Robin froze, and tried not to look either threatening or scared. She also tried to remember anything she might know or have heard about mermaids, but drew a stuttering blank of, but they aren't supposed to be real. None of the stories were supposed to be actually real, not like this. Robin wondered if maybe she had blundered into a movie set, or some sort of elaborate practical joke. It didn't make much more sense than an actual real-life mermaid, but still. Neither of them moved for a long moment, staring at each other. Eventually, Robin tried, "Hello?" Her voice sounded weirdly normal, and she cleared her throat self-consciously. The mermaid tilted her head slightly to one side and said in heavily accented English, "Hello." "I'm Robin," said Robin, relaxing slightly. "That is a bird, I think," said the mermaid. "Yes." "Is it your actual name, little bird?" "Yeah," Robin shrugged. "My parents liked birds, or something. Are you really—" Robin wasn't sure how she would have ended that sentence, but the mermaid smiled and propelled herself up to sit on a rock, dangling her tail in the water. "Would you like to touch?" she asked. She smoothed her hands down her body and over the top part of her tail as she asked. It didn't look like a fish tail, but it didn't look like pictures of mermaids either. There wasn't the telltale bend where a human woman's knees should have been, just a smooth, sinuous tail. If it was a costume, it was a very, very good one. It didn't look like a costume. Robin took a step forward, and the mermaid smiled at her again, bright and sharp as broken shells. Her tail was dry and cool, without either the slickness or the sharp edges of fish scales. Robin stood just close enough to reach over and run one finger down the side of what could have been the mermaid's thigh if she had legs. The mermaid swirled the tip of her tail in the tide pool. "Look down there," she said, and Robin looked without thinking. So I don't know if you can hear it, but I can certainly hear the difference in several edits and polishing between those two excerpts. And that's the last part of the process, editing. Once it's all written, once I'm happy with the story and the flow, I leave it for a few weeks, and then I go back and I read it from the beginning. And everything that I don't like, everything that doesn't make sense, every time a character says something that they wouldn't really say, I put a red line through it, and I rewrite it. And then I leave it for a few weeks, and I do it again. And then I give it to somebody else and ask them to do the same thing. And the number of typos, you wouldn't believe how many the software doesn't pick up, and the first 2 and 3 and 4 reads don't pick up. But after it's gone through that process, and I've had editorial suggestions from a beta reader, which is what you call the first person who reads your story, I go through, I do another edit, and then it goes off for a final edit. And then I call it finished. And we look at, making a cover and deciding if I like the working title or if it needs to change. And then I put it up and see if anyone wants to read it and see what other people think. So that is how I write. That is who I am. Thank you very much for listening. And if you would like to read some of these stories, if you would like to find out what happens to Robin and her cousins, I have my 2 novels available on Amazon. There'll be links down below. And I'm also on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, and I have a website, daniellelinder.com, which you can look up and you can see updates on what I'm writing, what I'm up to, and the new books when they come out. Thanks very much.